So the key question to think about here is what would happen if we looked at stirring things up for the better as a fundamental role of leadership? So thank you for joining us for this fourth of these conversations. And just a note about participation, we're recording this talk and sharing it. And because of this, we'll be asking participants to stay muted, but you're very welcome to put questions for me or for Tammy in the chat. And we'll respond to those. We'll respond to as many of those as we can. And today's conversation is called In This Place, We Are All Leaders. And I'm so excited to have Tammy Mudge here as today's guest. And Tammy Mudge is Illnew from Glooscap First Nation, a mother of four and a member of the Mi'kmaq Nation. And she's the manager of learning and evaluation at Everyone Everyday Kjipuktuk-Halifax, a truth and reconciliation initiative working to build a new system of neighborhood participation that is reconciliation focused and inclusive to all. And she's also a former part-time faculty member at Acadia University, where she taught Decolonizing Community Development. Tammy is also a member of the Atlantic Indigenous Evaluation Stewardship Circle and a member of the UNDRIP Working Group, mandated by the Canadian Evaluation Society Board, to provide direction on how to uphold the principles of United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and to contribute to its implementation. And for the last year and a half, the team at Everyone Everyday has been experimenting with practices of reciprocity, shared leadership, belonging, and participation. And we're going to talk with Tammy about what's going well, what kinds of challenges and surprises they've experienced, and how they're bringing these values and the focus on reconciliation into their internal dynamics and relationships as a team. Well, and thank you, Tammy, for being here. I'm really thrilled to have this conversation with you. And go for it.
I was just saying thank you. Well, Alan, it's great to be here.
Thank you. So I want to start off by just asking you if there's anything else you would like people to know about you by way of an introduction.
Well, thank you. That was a wonderful job. Gwe, Madawalin, Nindaloizi, Tammy Mudge, Lewe, Glooscap First Nation, so Lalioch. I mean, you said I was a mama. That's a big one. Perhaps maybe for our conversation, I love humor and laughter and jokes, and it's sort of probably a cultural thing. But so I might have a few laughs throughout the next hour we share together. But no, I think you've done a great introduction, and we'll just explore the next hour together, I suppose.
Thanks, Tammy. So can you tell us a little bit about Everyone Everyday? What is this project trying to accomplish?
Yeah. So we are about halfway through a 3-year sort of commitment so far. We piloted the program out of the Mi'kmaq Native Friendship Center about a year and a half ago. Currently, a year from June, I should say, we opened up a neighborhood shop on Gottingen Street. So it's in Kjipuktuk in Halifax, right across from our old friendship center that we had, the Mi'kmaq Native Friendship Center. So we consider ourselves a reconciliation initiative. We are part of the Mi'kmaq Native Friendship Center. And so we do have a focus on determining how we can implement truth and acts of reconciliation into neighborhoods, together with our team and with the residents here in the North End of Halifax is our focus right now. So ultimately, if we're thinking of our circle of change, or some might know it as a sort of a theory of change, how we're going to make an impact, we really want to create more socially cohesive, resilient communities here in the North End to start. That's are sort of reconciliation focused in our programming and our projects that we offer with community. And also want to build on the skills of community members and leverage shared assets with different organizations in the North End to really create sort of a web of inclusive participation within the residents of the neighborhoods, businesses, organizations here, and helping residents kind of see that they can change and build their neighborhood. Our city's changing, whether we want to or not. So it's important for us to be a part of how it's changing and really bringing community together. I know especially we started right on the cusp of COVID, and we certainly saw the need as that was sort of processing through as Mother Earth, Sikamu, was cleansing herself. We saw the need for communities to come together more and more. And so we're starting to see some really good examples of people really coming together based around sharing and offering their unique gifts. And so ultimately co-creating cooperative communities would be our impact here in North End and Kjipuktuk and beyond. Certainly no limitations there. And just, I guess the last thing I'll add is that we have what we call our support platform. So to help kind of perhaps explain what the heck everyone every day is a little better is there's about 5 key components. So we have our neighborhood shop on Gottingen Street, and it's filled with tools and resources. It's free for community members to use. It's a very inspiring and bright space, but yet it's still neutral in the sense to make everybody feel welcome. We have a community build trailer, which is sort of like an arm of our shop that can go out in communities for build projects. If people want to, the residents come and have an idea to build benches in their community or fix up something. We have a trailer that's mobile, so it's kind of like a mobile shop. And it allows us to build partnerships with other organizations and get into neighborhoods that, we may not have otherwise been able to reach as fast. And we have our newspapers, which are, I'll just mention those because they have been a very key successful piece of our platform. We've given out 29,000 newspapers to date. And what the newspapers have, we have about 3 program cycles a year. So while our shop is open all year long, we have about 3 6-week programs where the weeks are filled up with what we call sessions that our team co-designs with residents based around their capabilities and skills. So if I'm a community member and I'm a mechanic and I know how to change oil, maybe I do a session around teaching folks how to change their own oil, and it's free for community members to come and we supply things, and then they would learn, how to save $40 every 3 months, that kind of idea, So instead of it being focused on sort of what you don't have or a need that's found and identified in the community. It's more about what are the capabilities and skills, and let's bring those together and share those. So yeah, I guess lastly, sorry, is our support team and our neighborhood team. So we have about 10 of us, and some of us, I do learning and evaluation, but our neighborhood project team are the folks that if you came into our shop with an idea or to be inspired or just to make your own coffee and have a seat and get to know your neighbors, they would be the folks you would see most often. And we'll probably talk about it here in a little bit about our approach, but it's really trying to inspire residents to create things and build out their own neighborhood. Sorry, that was probably a long explanation, but it's a little complex. So hopefully by the end of the hour, you'll understand a little further. And certainly if you're anywhere near Kjipuktuk, come on and see our shop.
Thank you. Can I just, this is a little, I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more specifically around, like it's this beautiful program that's very much about neighborhood participation and involving people and sort of like working from skill and all of these pieces. And I'm wondering, can you say a little bit about how the reconciliation piece is sort of woven through that?
Yeah, for sure. So it showed up in a few ways because we've identified that ourselves and as our team, we need to sort of get a deeper understanding and deeper learning of what that means to center truth and reconciliation in our own work, and let alone trying to support it out in the neighborhood. So ever since the pilot, and being a part of the Friendship Center, we've had lots of staff build co-design sessions around Mi'kmaq culture or other Indigenous cultures. And we've come to find that there's a huge interest in that. And then beyond just sort of learning about these cultures, we also started having folks in the community wanting to they would want to inquire more about bigger ways they can contribute to this path towards reconciliation, understanding about the land they're on, how to write a meaningful land acknowledgement, or perhaps if they were from away, what the treaties were there. And also there's opportunities for sharing circles where they can be vulnerable if they choose to and ask questions that they might not feel comfortable or have a chance to otherwise around Indigenous culture, because communication is the key to kind of move forward in this and build relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous folks. So because those were beginning to really stand out as our most attended sessions, we decided to create our Truth and Reconciliation Project, which is really just focused on trying to determine what those actions out in the community could be, but then also finding out what North End residents want to learn about, whether it was our Mi'kmaq History Month we celebrated, and they just wanted to learn about the culture, or whether we had one that was a Maui Omi or powwow etiquette. We have a beautiful story around that, where one resident in particular, I was fortunate enough to capture her story. She was non-Indigenous, and she went to our powwow etiquette session where Jesse, one of our dancers here at the center, sort of shared with folks about what you can expect and what powwows are about. Because as a Mi'kmaq person myself, I always say, if you want to learn, that's the first place you should go if you want to learn about the culture. And this one resident I've been speaking with said, I always thought I couldn't go there, that it wasn't a place for me, that it was maybe insulting if I go and I shouldn't be there. And so just by attending this one session, she saw that other folks that were like her, perhaps, had the same questions and didn't know. And by the time she left the session, she looked at the powwow trail, and it really broke down those barriers of, she understood that there's a elders section for the elders, and that the MC will tell you when everyone can join in dancing, and that you would ask before you touch or take pictures of regalia, but please ask. It's okay. We love celebrating our culture, and just stuff like that. And so not only did she build a relationship with a local urban Indigenous community member that she hadn't had, more importantly, she broke down those barriers, and she went on quite a few powwows during powwow season. And so I always think of that story and I think, imagine that times 1,000, or imagine, that personal transformation. And so when it comes to reconciliation, I mean, that's one little way it played out. And we have lots of wonderful stories like that. So it's been playing out that way as far as in our programming. And then with our team learning, we're really realizing the depth of time needed for our own team to kind of realize where we're all at on our reconciliation journey. And it's certainly, we're all at different places. So that's been one thing too, to sort of capture in a respectful way where to start on our journey together. And we started with sort of a book club for our team, and we also created a reconciliation framework, which I could talk about a little bit later. But so yeah, it showed up in many ways. And we've always said from the beginning, we're a reconciliation initiative. We want to center truth and reconciliation. And it's okay to say, we don't know what the heck that exactly means yet, but we're discovering. And now we're starting to see ways that we can share with others, and we can go back to them and go back to our urban Indigenous community and find out if they were meaningful and have impact, which they're really showing some promise. So it's been a journey, that's for sure. I think I probably went beyond your question, but
no, that's awesome. I really appreciate what you were saying. And in fact, I'm thinking about it in terms of, you're talking about, you sort of said this piece around, we're just kind of figuring it out, right? Like it's sort of a bit of a journey, and we're kind of developing it as we go. And today is really, this series is primarily about leadership, and I think this was one of the things about Everyone Every Day that I really appreciate, and why I wanted to reach out and have this conversation is that, like, I've really seen this project try to integrate sort of like a very different, like, sort of an approach to leadership that is really coming more from Mi'kmaq values, from sort of a spirit of reconciliation. And I'm wondering, if you could say something about how, like, sort of Mi'kmaq ways of understanding and practicing leadership, and how you've been really trying to integrate that into the work that you've been doing, both kind of as a team and also with kind of community leadership.
Yeah, no, that's excellent conversation to have, because so I'm from Glooscap First Nation. I grew up in mostly in my Mi'kmaq community, and certainly the idea of the Indian Chiefing Council is not sort of the leadership I'm about to speak about, because that's sort of its own thing. Um, but there's lots of qualities in Mi'kmaq leadership, like around being future oriented, and you know making decisions that sort of help to aid things today, but also will help to aid things in 10 years from now. And it's very heavy in collaboration, which so is something that we carry over here. And again, going back to that capabilities focus. So our team, it's very horizontal for the most part in a leadership way. And sometimes that's most of the times that's great, but obviously there's challenges when everyone's sort of bringing a voice to the table, which is beautiful. It's just the realization that more time is needed, and equal understanding from everybody is needed. But beautiful things can happen, and little corners can be discovered when you have that kind of collaboration. But yeah, we even as a team, we're very dynamic. Everybody's bringing something different, and so sort of adapting on that, just like when we expect of our residents to sort of bring in their skills to share and have that cross learning and for the better of everyone. Which brings up another point, is that it's, just like our Mi'kmaq communities are very, it's not about the individual, it's not about ownership and putting up fences, it's sort of about the collective. And so again, that's an approach that we take, not even just obviously out to the community and how we want to move out in the North End as our team and through the work, but also our team here at the shop, how we work and we go through decision making, and again, yeah, planning ahead. Yeah, I would say those are the things that stand out the most. That kind of collective responsibility too. Like I think of kinship, that kind of kinship model within many First Nation communities. Um, and that's sort of something we practice here, where there's that collective responsibility. And all the while you're honing on everyone's individual gifts that Gisul's creator gave them, but you're also recognizing that collective responsibility that it takes a village. And so yeah, those are some pretty predominant aspects that kind of cross over with how we approach the work. And I guess lastly, and this is somewhat newer in the work, we've created a Indigenous guide group. And so the practice of sort of having folks that are well respected and grounded in traditional knowledge to be the group of folks that we would approach for questions that are surfacing. Because like I said, rightfully so, we're just speaking to the truth in the sense that we're just trying to figure out what that means, but we know we want to do it and we know we're committed to centering truth and reconciliation. So having a guide group is similar to sort of many First Nations, certainly not all, but many First Nations that would have either an elders council or that have more of a matriarch sort of process to who they would advise in the community. And so we also have a Indigenous guide group that helps with those sort of decisions that we seek guidance from. Yeah, and I think those are the major ones that kind of stick out that are similar, I would say.
And can you can you kind of maybe, like, I'm thinking about what you were saying around, so there's these different roles, and if you were to imagine like a specific situation around sort of both sort of holding and acknowledging people's individual capacities and what people are bringing, and also that collective responsibility and that relationship to a guide group, right? Like how does that, can you tell us a little story of what that might look like in practice?
Yeah, so within our team context, yeah, I think of when we're doing, all of the majority of our decision making collaboratively around the table, it was pretty quick to see naturally whether the person identified with it or not, like the gifts of each individual person. So for example, we had our Festival of Everyone when we first opened our shop, which was fantabulous. It was a great festival. We closed down the street, which was really tough to do, I hear. But we had lots of people come, and so one member of our team just naturally sort of rose to that occasion, where they were very connected with lots of folks. They had everything from sort of insurance experience to all the operational pieces, and really led the way to organize a group of volunteers because they were so connected throughout the organization, and just sort of she naturally rose that way. So that was great. And because she decided to sort of take that on, we sort of filled in all the other pieces around, designing sessions or other little components of that day. But when it came down to it, and as we debriefed afterwards and our before, we were all equally responsible for sort of things that were happening and going on. And so I think it was really important, really validating for this team member who kind of rose to that occasion, but also important for them to know that we were there collectively as a team, and that it wasn't an expectation for all of those pieces to go smoothly, that we were all there to kind of back that up. And then in another occasion, a different team member who was really connected with our guide group and who was also an artisan, she sort of rose up and was able to cycle in for a different program, a huge cohort of Indigenous artists. And so the rest of us would organize, the logistics and the operational pieces and the purchasing and everything. So this might be more surfacey level, but it was just, I think, with a small team and with the fact that we're mirroring the diversity of the neighborhood, I think that it was quick to see what folks were good at, but then also like making sure they knew that they didn't just kind of hold that bucket, but that we were grateful that they were great, that that they excelled in that way or another. So
yeah, so that's really nice. It's like the individual and their particular sort of gifts and capacities within that kinship network of, we're not talking about a sort of competitive kind of workplace where people are sort of like, this is my project, that's your project, but really we all share this and we're all committed to making sure that it happens, even if there might be one person who's sort of taking that leadership in it.
That's right. And that's another Mi'kmaq teaching that certainly was grounded into me, was the fact that, whether someone's bringing it to your attention or you acknowledge your gift yourself, it's also important for you to act into your gift that the creator Gisulg, and in Mi'kmaq terms, has given you. So yeah, it's kind of both that collective responsibility and then also that person sort of walking in the way of their gift that they had. So yeah, it was, well, I guess that would be another crossover too.
Thank you. And so I'm aware that everyone every day is, you're talking about these ways that you're really, actually, I wonder, before I go into that, I wonder if you could share, because I think the other thing that's been really, really beautiful to watch in what you're doing is that there's really like very active participation in a leadership kind of way from community as well, right? Like I'm, sort of seeing the newsletter and seeing that there's someone who's come forward and they're now there's like someone who's not part of the team who's taking on an entire project and sort of supporting that and moving it forward in collaboration and all of these pieces. And how have you, like, I think a lot of organizations that maybe work within a more, what would be considered, I guess, like a volunteer model or something like that, it doesn't necessarily have that feeling of people really belonging and being a part of the project. It's kind of like, just come and give your time and we're really grateful for that, but it's sort of an insider outsider kind of thing. And I'm wondering, like, I'm putting you on the spot a bit because this is not one of the questions that we talked about ahead of time, but I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that has come about, that you've been able to really support leadership to happen from community, from people who are not technically a part of the work team.
Oh, but they are. No. Yeah, no, I am. No, that's great. That's a great question, and certainly geared around leadership. And we are all leaders here, as the title goes. But yeah, no, I mean, that's really a huge part of this, is wanting to build that ownership and agency among residents, and also helping them to realize, like, oh, this me, little old me can make this change and change literally how our neighborhood moves, operates, looks. And so, yeah, the beauty of it is we're seeing lots and lots more stories where residents are kind of coming in and getting comfortable with the place, and whether it's they're volunteering to wash the front windows or whether they're coming in and deciding, well, I want to learn about quilting, but I don't know anything about it. And then, connecting with other residents that have the same interest. And then all of a sudden, the two of those folks are co-hosting a session and designing it. And I mean, really the idea, when we first started the pilot, we sort of had to come up with kind of these project ideas. So I should explain. So there's a project theme, which might be let's make, and then there'd be multiple sessions, I should say, as well, to clarify underneath, which might be building a bench or just any sort of making things. So when I say session, I mean those individual pieces. But yeah, so those connections are happening and people are sort of taking ownership of that. And I think that, one trick has been, or one challenge, I should say, somewhat of a challenge, at least something we're trying to discover how to move around is, as one of the 50 plus projects of the Friendship Center, a lot of those programs are service-based or they're targeted necessarily just for Indigenous folks or urban Indigenous folks. But with ours, as we are trying to center truth and reconciliation, we're still trying to be inclusive to all. And so I think one of the biggest, bumpers to trying to get people to the point where they do take ownership and where they do want to start leading things in their community is just having themselves realize they can come in and start doing and taking and moving things on their own. Like it's been really interesting to see, you might see a person walk by the windows and then a few days later they walk by, step in, and then they go leave. And then, then at the end of the week they're coming and sitting and having a coffee. And so I think it's just this, like we say, the speed of trust, the time that it takes for people to come in and to get to that point, because there's almost like a spectrum of participation, and some folks go along it, some folks stay wherever, but that takes time and trust, and for folks to know that we're not just this, funky little shop that moved into a community where people have been displaced in the same generation, or there's gentrification everywhere. Like, so I think that's such a big part of it. And thank goodness we were connected to the Friendship Center, I will say, because it had been a hub in the North End since the late 60s. And even folks outside the urban Indigenous community were already trusting and trusted the Friendship Center. And so we had a lot of those, we had that kind of reputation, if you will, or those relationships in place, because it takes time for people to kind of come and feel that sense of ownership. But we are starting to see that. I was speaking earlier how we just finished sort of putting out our new report. It's on halifaxeveryone.ca if you want to check it out. But it's beautiful. There's just so many stories, you couldn't put them all in it. But where people are sort of taking ownership of that and making connections and bringing people out of isolation. And I think like some 36% of North End residents are single resident homes. And so it's people, I think they're just sort of itching to have that. And when you can kind of have a team that inspires and helps folks realize what a skill and gift is, you don't have to have a certificate or anything, so helping folks to realize that in themselves and giving them an opportunity, free of charge, any skill level, to kind of come in and display their talents or to receive knowledge, it gets them comfortable. And I think that was a big part of people kind of stepping up to the plate. And the more and more we're seeing is our team's kind of backing off some, and people are meeting outside of program or shop times to do their own thing. And I mean, that's ideally what it's about. And it's nice to see that happening more and more. I don't know if I spoke to the question or not, but
totally. And I mean, I was just thinking as you were talking about, I mean, I think one of the things that feels quite unusual, to me, as someone who has been in a lot of sort of spaces that were kind of, quote unquote, community center type spaces or those sorts of things, there's a real feeling of like people will come in to work on their own projects. Like, it's like there's a sewing machine and you just come in and you do some sewing. It's like there's a real sense of this is a place where everyone can be. And I think that that's really like really interesting and beautiful to see, because we're so used to things being very like, this is owned by these people and you only come in if they invite you in and you only stay in these hours, and like that real sort of like enclosing of where people are welcome in a sense. And so I'm really like, I'm kind of listening to what you're saying and thinking about all of the very intentional work that's gone into like welcoming people in, and then making it really clear that it's like, yeah, stay and have a coffee. Like this, you don't have to leave at the end of the session that you're here for. There's like other things happening and so on. So I just wanted to sort of say that as someone who has experienced it as a participant, that it has a very different feel from a lot of like programming that might be happening.
Yeah.
So, coming back to the question around working together, I'm aware that everyone every day is really trying to shift, as we were talking about some of the dynamics that happen within a work team kind of context, or, between sort of like leadership and the team, or like those kinds of dynamics. And yet you're also having to work within some of the like the same sorts of structures that most workplaces, most organizations are working within. Like you still have people who are employed, and you still have, funders and funder expectations and project cycles and all of these kinds of things that are, sort of what a lot of workplaces are dealing with. And, I'm wondering how it's been to try to work differently together, and also with program participants, but still have to kind of navigate some of these systems that workplaces usually have to navigate.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is tricky. And as you were saying, like with community centers, or even programming models, community program models, where it's, you have this short term, maybe it's a 2-year and a certain small dollar amount. And not only that, it's maybe it's just for the African Nova Scotian community, or maybe it's just for the urban Indigenous, or maybe it's for, and so it really silos folks, and it's very competitive, a lot of those funding models that sort of come down. And if folks, the diversity of the North End is beyond measure, and it's so rich and beautiful, and so that's super, problematic. Now, I will say, in this case, it's the same thing with, we wouldn't be the only ones to speak about reporting, and obviously funders have certain sort of objectives or milestones or indicators, where you're hitting the mark or not, and so yeah, one thing that, I don't know if we've asked for forgiveness or permission first. I think probably forgiveness, but is around that time piece again, like growing, like I said, at the speed of trust, is that, those relationships really have to exist first, because we are in communities where they have had those, whether we're working with another local community organization or not, like it's been that competing interest around funding. And so it's been a bit tricky. I think being part of the Friendship Center has been very helpful. But again, it's helping folks understand that we're not either a service model either, or it's not about volunteers. It's kind of that reciprocity piece. So even just sort of breaking down the narrative on our team's mind, let alone, the community and funders' minds, about working in a place of reciprocity, or the old barter system, and keeping away necessarily from transactional pieces, but the fact that let's connect assets, community assets, and instead of competing on different, funding pots or different grants and things, let's sort of see where we can kind of co-opt that and work together. But it's definitely been a challenge, because when you want to collaborate with certain people, or you need certain resources, or you need to have time for learning, and those cycles, they don't always line up with reporting cycles or other application pieces. So it's been tricky, and we're trying to build up community resilience currently with things, whether it's through bringing people out of isolation or just all these different current challenges and crises that are happening now, but then also be able to build up on these things so that we have more resilient, cohesive communities in the future in 10 years. And a lot of those models are kind of like those short-term things. So it's definitely tricky, but I think through collaborative partnerships and shared assets with local organizations, we're kind of having the ability to sidestep that at times if we need to. But yeah, it's definitely still exists. And explaining the participatory approach as opposed to sort of a service delivery or that kind of thing, it's tricky. But we're starting to see progress. We're starting to see some of those shorter term outcomes come out. And so it's just the time needed, but the relationships have to be established, especially in diverse communities where, there's gentrification and some oppressive systems operating and that kind of thing. So
absolutely. And you mentioned this piece around, like, there's also sort of an unlearning piece that has to happen. I mean, we're all living in this world and we all absorb so many of these the lessons about like competing for grants or this being a program or like those kinds of things. And I'm wondering, like, have you, from an internal perspective in terms of the team, have you found anything that has been particularly helpful around noticing ways that might show up internally sometimes and then figuring out how to kind of unpack it? Or like, I'm thinking in terms of sort of, the kind of work, decolonization and equity work that a lot of organizations are trying to do, and how so much of that is really noticing where we're kind of getting stuck in patterns of like reproducing those dominant systems that we're trying to shift. And I'm wondering if you have if there's anything in particular that's felt really successful or like a learning around doing that work as a team around some of those internal pieces.
Yeah, I mean, as far as sort of implementing and decolonizing practices, we've most recently created GOCOM, which is our Truth and Reconciliation Framework, with 6 branching out strategies, so 6 buckets of roles and responsibilities that our team that we're responsible for. So we have, communications and designs, research and evaluation, strategic planning and leadership, so they're again on the website if you want to check it out. But so that's actually what's really neat is it's not just sort of this document that kind of helps us to review our decolonized practices we're implementing or even actions towards reconciliation with our Indigenous kin. But it's actually a huge tree document or a huge tree image that's in our shop and at the center. And so GOCOM means big old tree in Mi'kmaq, just for the so in case you're wondering where that came from. But it's a big old tree and there's different components to it, and I won't go through them all now, but the leaves are representative of the actions that our team is actually taking, whether it's we've considered with the guide group that it's a decolonized practice or an action towards a more reconciled future with our First Nation, Métis, and Inuit kin. And they're on the wall or on the tree that's on this wall. And mind you, there is like a 30-page document as well, but too often those truth and reconciliation frameworks sit and gather dust somewhere. So we created this big, large tree image. It's more of an interactive tool with community, with partners who come in. We can actually say, here's what we're doing. Literally, these are the actions. Let's talk about it. And during our monthly meetings, team time, we'll come together as well as with advice from our guide group, Indigenous guide group, and we'll bring down the action. And maybe the action will fall to the ground and be absorbed by Sikamu, Mother Earth, or maybe it'll blossom into a new, more adaptive, more appropriate practice. And so that's a framework that we are just starting to implement alongside with our guide group. And that is sort of one way that we're kind of keeping our checks and bounds on our commitment and our actions or inactions towards truth and reconciliation and decolonized practice in general, which benefits everyone, of course. And so that's a way we keep it in our conversation. And we evaluate those actions on a regular basis with help with our Indigenous guide group. And so I guess I think it's important to have structural things like that in place too. And mind you, the framework is a beautiful image and incorporates all this Mi'kmaq content as well. So it's keeping us accountable to these actions right out in front in our shop, but it's also a conversation piece with residents to teach Mi'kmaq cultural components. It also shows our partners our values and how we're centering, how we're figuring out how to center truth and reconciliation. So I think, I mean, that's just one key piece of our work that we have now. And it just speaks, of course, to decolonized practice and our journey to truth and reconciliation, but and out in the neighborhood. But yeah, that's going through those and having community input on the creation of those things too, of course, so that they see it looks and feels like the North End, looks and feels like Mi'kmaq. It incorporates people, land, and nature. Yeah.
Thank you. I want to pause just for a second before I ask another question and just see if there's anyone, just as a reminder, if there's anyone who is, sort of sitting on a question that you would like to ask, you're very welcome to do so. And you can put it in the chat, or if you really want to, you're welcome to unmute and speak it into the room, but just be aware that, this is being recorded. And so that just depends on how you feel about your voice being heard. But you're welcome to place it in the chat as well. And I'll keep an eye on that if there is anything that comes up. So you've been talking a lot about sort of the ways that you've been kind of, really trying to integrate Mi'kmaq principles of leadership and decolonization and decolonial practice and all of these things into the work that you're doing. And I'm wondering if there is anything that's been particularly sort of surprising or inspiring for you personally around doing this work with a group of, like, a pretty diverse group of people, both the staff and then the larger neighborhood.
Yeah, I mean, there's been many instances, I guess. I think one is for myself, and as a Mi'kmaq woman, as Illnew, I suppose. And so just sort of speaking out into the neighborhood wise to start, I think I really gained an understanding, and I guess this applies for our team too, but at Everyone Every Day, we say that we want to have truth and reconciliation manifest out in the neighborhoods, right? Which eventually we do hope to have institutional change, go bigger and bigger. But it was really, I learned pretty quickly once we started connecting with residents and through the Friendship Center more often, that really that personal transformation, like the story I spoke of earlier, is really the key of where it starts. And that starts with having interactions with Indigenous folks and non-Indigenous residents and having that connection. And I've heard that our Everyone Every Day was sort of the opening opportunity for those folks to come together, which is always wonderful to hear. But it before you can have sort of that collective transformation, you need to have many of these personal transformations. And I've seen it on our team, but I've certainly seen and have had the pleasure of hearing and learning about it with community members, where there's ahas or there's feelings of really understanding another culture, or it's not about a melting pot, it's about creating shared lives. And so sort of knowing that other side and living together and the peace that comes from it. But yeah, I've learned that you really have to start with that personal transformation before you can kind of get this collective transformation. And it's really a feeling that you get when how someone's telling you that story and that's happened, and it feels really good. And so then on our team too, it's sort of the same sort of learning. And one thing is that deep learning I was talking about for our team. We need that. We need moments of healing. We need moments of rest. I've certainly learned that in this really emergent work that we're trying to figure out, we've had to learn how to prioritize that, because we didn't always know that it was there, it existed until it was too late, or without the guidance and support from the guide group that we have now, and other elders and traditional teachers in the community. So I think sort of that calm against the storm, like in having to find those moments of deep learning, healing, and rest are all needed to have a healthy team within, so that we can help and mirror that into community. And so, yeah, it's something that both inspiring and not so much surprising, but it was a really good insight into when we're thinking ahead and we're wanting to create more reconciled futures on a more bigger geographic scale outside Mi'kma'ki. It's good to know those things when you're sort of planning out what perhaps next steps could be, and so that you can value everybody's time. And also another Mi'kmaq practice, I won't say First Nation because I can only speak for Mi'kmaq, but is around understanding knowledge and gaining knowledge as a sacred process. So whether it's, making a misstep or not, it's still you respect that knowledge and respect that person's time or the time that was spent to have that shared with you, and it's still learning and you grow from there and do better actions. And so I guess this thing called time is really key. And going back to your earlier question is like being in partnerships, and not that you always can pick your funding buckets, but like being in partnerships that way, to help them understand the relationships that are needed, because that's certainly the time thing is always there. And I will just say this, what was really neat that we did when we opened our shop in June, a year from June, we had our funding partners and we tried to get, speaking of leadership, and not horizontally, we tried to get as many board members or as many, CEOs to this event as we could, but we had a partners gathering, and it was really cool because in my humble experience, first time I've seen, pretty high up, if you will, folks in these, whether these foundations or these other organizations that are funding you come, and as well as local residents that were participating. MNFC or Friendship Center, Mi'kmaq Native Friendship Center staff, our team, and some elders and knowledge keepers come together. And certainly not everybody made the invite, but a lot did from all of those 3 or 4 different groups, we'll say, of folks that came together, and we did a blanket exercise, and it was emotional and it was raw, and we had supports in place for people, and that was transformational. To be in relationship, and not to say we see them all the time, but to do that on a regular basis, I think that's really cool. And I hadn't witnessed that in other organizations I've worked for where folks came together in that way. And that was something, I'm getting off topic, but it was a big part of leading in a good way through helping folks see through your eyes, and everybody leaving there with straight eyes. So honesty and clean hands, truth. And so it was a really great way to start. It's when we first opened our shop, and keeping that up. So I guess that does speak to leadership, and certainly does speak to building a relationship in a good way with everybody that's in part of it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think, I'm sure that people who are listening who have relationships with funders are, sort of thinking about how transformative that is, actually extremely transformative, right? Because that's not usually the way organizations interact with their funders. And so that is actually, I think, a really beautiful example of sort of leading on more of a systemic level, right? To kind of shift maybe some of those dynamics. There is one question in the chat. And the first piece of this is lovely to listen to and learn from. Thank you, Tammy, for sharing and articulating your learnings. And then the two questions I can think of right now are: one, how do you onboard and teach to embody tacit or implicit things in cultural and leadership practices that people new to your community aren't familiar with? Like, how do you figure out how to articulate what to articulate, noticing what's different, like from dominant culture? It's a great question.
Yeah, that is a great question. And really interesting because we just hired, we're a very small team, and we've just grown. We just hired on 3 new folks. So we've grown to 10, which sounds like a very small team, especially in emergent work areas. But I think that it took us a little while it's still taking us, I guess, a little while to understand kind of where to start, whether it's cultural learning, whether it's trying to introduce this co-design process of how we work with community that's about collaboration and building participation among residents, as opposed to sort of just running a workshop and getting all the supply, running everything. And so I think that we're still on that journey as far as sort of creating maybe a package that would sort of onboard folks to come in and understand the participatory approach, which is how we find ourselves different is this approach that we take to neighborhood building. But I think that, funny enough, the last couple of times we've onboarded folks, it's been in the midst of a program. And so I think really being able to not so much read something or watch it talk or that sort of thing. I think being immersed in community and from someone beginning to be able to sit there alongside community and experience the different stages of this co-design process of building this program of getting, connecting different organizations with community members and sharing assets and I think just being there and doing that. And luckily, I mean, we've been able to do that with a small team so far. But I think it's one of those things that you can read about it, because I think of when I first started, you can read about this approach, but until you're actually there and with community, because every community is different. And I will say some tools that we've adopted that we've learned about through a participatory cities approach, we've had to adapt to people, place, and the land here, so that folks onboarding can kind of connect with it more, but that they're culturally relevant to actually the North End. And so I'm going around in circles here, but I guess it's a very experiential learning piece that's important. And I don't know if I answered your question, if you're speaking about onboarding in that way, about introducing people to this new approach, and it's not service-based, and we're highly collaborative, and it's as much horizontal leadership as we can kind of apply. But yeah, that's been the journey so far.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank
Yeah.
you. I'm aware that we're pretty much at time now, and so I want to just the person who asked the question in the chat says, yes, you have given a great answer to my first question. Thanks.
Well,
and we're pretty much at the time to wrap up now. And I just want to say, I want to ask you if there's anything else that you would like to share as we're moving toward closing today.
Yeah, wow. I'm always like curious to hear what other folks, I'm so used to sort of, maybe that's that collaboration, co-design dynamic. I'm just curious about the other lives that are sitting here on this talk to kind of hear and learn from those aspects. But yeah, no, it's interesting to be in a vulnerable place to be able to like, here's what we're doing. We're not sure what this is, but here's what we're doing. Here's what we learned. Oh, community tore a strip there. They gave us auntie vibes. We weren't supposed to do that. Like, I think there's so much growth in just that rawness of vulnerability and kind of going through the work. And as long as you're doing that alongside community in a good way, giving time for relationships and space, that I think, like we said, holding knowledge is sacred. If you mess up, that's okay. You're holding that as sacred, but you have those relationships. So I just think that there's so much value in that. And it's not about the end product. A lot of these sessions we talk about, sure, if you're building a garden, a vegetable garden, yeah, sure, that's an end product. That's great. You're going to feed people. But the magic that happens just through the co-design, through connecting people, but even planting, even building, like the stories that are shared, cross-cultural that are shared. I mean, those are the transformational pieces. And yes, then you have a beautiful garden that can help sustain things. But it's really great. The relationships are key, and you just have to find the space for them, and you have to insist on leading that way for them to really ground and be rooted, in my humble opinion, I should say. But
that's really beautiful. Well, and Tammy, thank you so much for being here and for this very transformational project that you're helping to steward, and for being here to share with us about it. It's been I really appreciate having been able to have this conversation with you. So
well, yeah, thank you all.